Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. I'm Tom Holt. I'm the director of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training here at Michigan State University. And I'm here with one of my excellent co-hosts, as always.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Fisher. I'm a postdoc here at Michigan State, and I work with the Center for Training for Law Enforcement.
All right. Well, I know our normal format is that we have a guest on and we talk about a very specific topic, but this time we're going to do it a little bit different. We're going to do a sort of cybercrime power hour, but instead of doing shots, we're going to do shots of topics. So we're going to talk about some hot button issues at the moment in either research or policy, and we have 4 fantastic guests with us who are actually here in studio, which is exceedingly rare. And I have the pleasure of having some of my good friends and colleagues here, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hey, Rutger or Ruger. I'm a full professor at Leiden University, NSCR, and I'm the director of the Center of Expertise Cybersecurity at the Holt University of Applied Sciences.
Dr. Jin Lee from George Mason University. Good to be back.
Hi everyone, my name's Cassandra Cross and I'm a professor in the School of Justice at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia.
Hi, I'm Thomas Dearden, Associate Professor of Sociology and Hub Coordinator at the Center for Peace Studies and Violence Prevention at Virginia Tech.
All right, so this is fantastic. We have some returning guests, friends of the pod with us. We have some new folks. This is going to be really fun. So we're going to try to cover a couple of different things. And I apologize, my voice is a little bit out. I lost my voice earlier in the week, but hopefully it's tolerable. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes each time to talk about some different topics. And we'll start off with the first one being social media bans for youth. Increasingly, we're seeing countries and individual states implementing unique bans on social media, whether it's for people under the age of 16 or whether it's new requirements. Thomas, I know you're in Virginia and so are you, Jen. Can you talk about a new policy that's been instituted in your state?
Yeah, as of just about a month ago, our governor signed in a ban for those under 16 that can only be on social media for 1 hour a day.
How do they keep track of that, though?
It's a good question. I don't think we have all of those answers yet. I know at least partially they're looking at kind of the registration data to see what people are claiming their age is when they sign up for social media. And if it's anything like some of our other bans, they'll probably be looking at whether their IP address is coming from Virginia or not.
Yeah, and so I'm reading a little bit now, but it looks like they're going to use various methods to verify whether or not a particular user is actually a minor, right? So that's also a problem, is that you may track a certain IP, but how do you know that that IP is of a minor? How do you know that they're under 16? So there seems to be a lot of moving parts going on, but that seems to be where Virginia is headed in the new year, it seems.
Well, seems to, it's going to have to take a mix of social and technical responses. It's not going to be one technical IP tracker that's going to answer all the questions. It's going to take parents, right, their involvement. So I'm sure there's a lot of ongoing conversations.
Does this just seem like a Band-Aid over a bullet hole? I mean, is it really going to make that much of a difference to keep kids either off completely or on for an hour only? What do we think? We're all entitled to our opinions here. There's no right or wrong.
I think there is also symbolic value to this, right? And I'm not sure if I'm pro or against, but at least I'm a parent. I got a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 3-year-old. So the 10-year-old, this is actually an issue. I want to have a phone. I want to go on social media. In the Netherlands, I think broader in Europe, there's a debate about whether or not we should limit the use of social media of kids 16 and below. No, I'm not sure yet what to think about it, but at least having some guidelines of it might not be healthy to be too much on social media when you're very young could help parents to actually do something, because in the end it's not only a technical thing, of course. It's something that schools, parents, whatever, they need to give the good examples and make sure kids play outside instead of only being on their phone.
Yeah, so I actually read a book recently. He's a social psychologist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And I read this book because it was introduced to me by someone in the community who told me, hey, we should restrict social media access to youth because read this book. And I read it, and prior to reading the book, I was like, I don't know if this is a good idea. Like, what's the end goal of it? How practical, feasible is it to cut social media from one's life. How detrimental is it really? Like, is there evidence pointing to any sort of negative side effects of social media? The book does a good job of going through the harms of social media use at a young age. So there are things to acknowledge, but going back to what you said, I'm not sure if it's containable. I'm not sure if it's practical, right? So thinking about other human behaviors that had age restrictions on youth, I feel like if someone was going to access it or engage in that behavior, they're going to do it regardless of it, right? So for me, it's not, these policies might be one way to get around it, but it's just, I feel like there has to be, if it's really that detrimental for that demographic, I feel like we need an understanding across the board of why is it, what in particular about social media, and how do we absolve this issue? Because without that, it just seems like nothing is getting done. It's just don't do it because I said so, because it's bad for you. But if people don't know it, I don't know what is the end goal in that, right? So, yeah.
I think too, a question that keeps coming to my mind is how are we defining what social media is, right? What are the platforms that are being quote unquote banned, right, from these kids? Because what comes to my mind, we were talking earlier about how important YouTube is in terms of learning, right? Whether it's learning technical skills, whether it's just learning about something you're interested in, but is YouTube going to be considered social media? Is that now going to be cut off from children that want to learn about these different things? I think a lot about digital skills. If you're going to take away social media, then kids may not be engaging with technology the same way they were before. Are they learning the skills that they need to be safe online? I don't know.
It's an interesting thought about the types of social media. There's been something of a transition where historically a lot of the social media was very participatory. Things like Facebook, which is now, I guess, a thing for our parents' generation or my generation, I guess, now. But the newer social medias are much more passive, right? When you're on TikTok, you're likely not posting as much as you are viewing, which really changes that dynamic. And I don't think we have that research yet.
Yeah, I feel, being a parent, like this is a good thing potentially, which sounds odd. I don't know that a full ban is effective, but also limiting is good. There's not just the problem of whether it's sexual solicitation or other issues, but more generally that problem of perceptual development of how life is or what a person is doing, that sort of artificial presentation of here is my life, in quotes, and how that might affect kids' brains, how that might affect their emotional development. I feel like there is some value in this. I think about the prior Surgeon General here in the US who said that this is a true problem. And to me, bans aren't the solution, but they are at least an important starting point towards some kind of broader conversation. Whether it's regulation or otherwise, I don't know. But Cass, you haven't mentioned anything yet. Do you have any opinions?
Yeah, so Australia has enacted a social media ban for those that are under 16 from certain social media platforms, and a lot of the discussion in an Australian context, because this is yet to be implemented, is around how you enforce it. The legislation in our context actually places that responsibility on the platforms themselves to regulate it, as opposed to, I guess, external bodies. And that then kind of brings in, how do you determine if the user is under 16? And I think at the moment there's a number of different trials happening around different age verification processes. But that ultimately captures the entire population, not just those that are under 16, because those that are over 16 still have to verify their age in a certain way to be able to access it. And I think, there's pros and cons. We know that social media has really detrimental impacts on young people. And we know that there have been some really horrific circumstances where young people have taken their lives, and just the really terrible toll that it's taken. But we also know that we need to empower our young people to have digital literacy, to have skills to go online, to negotiate what's true and what's not. That's a really critical part of our lives. And I think it's a really difficult line to try and traverse around. Our entire lives are digital, if we think about it, and there's a requirement for us to engage digitally, and to take that away or to restrict that in certain ways, there are certainly arguments for it, but I'm probably on the fence for this one, and it's challenging around that enforcement Because you think about the unintended consequences that's going to happen around enforcement, around young people that are using it in a really proactive, positive way. If you think about some of the challenges for young people in terms of where they're located, in Australia we clearly have a lot of people that are connected through technology in regional and remote areas, and taking that ability to connect away with their communities, not just locally but globally, can have a really devastating impact.
I think too, like the monetization that comes behind a lot of social media platforms is, a question, at least within the American context, is it fair to say you can't earn money this way because you're under 16? I think about some of the documentaries that have come out recently about children that have been basically, used by their parents to build out this online presence. I think about, I don't know, I can't remember the kid's name, but he's just playing with toys on YouTube, right? And they've made millions and millions of dollars as a family. And so I think too, I guess what I come back to is, as a non-parent, I see it as sort of a stepping on my responsibility, right? It's, if I were a parent, I would take it upon myself to teach my kid these skills, and but again, that's the assumption that the parents are going to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of on the fence too.
That's true. My only worry as a parent, as an academic, I would say no, yeah. But as a parent, you know how addictive social media is. That's the only real worry I have. The rest is something you can teach them, you can guide them, you can help them, you can be a good parent and make sure that they talk with you, right? But only the addictive part of social media, that's the only thing that worries me. But I honestly think that restricting it is going to be impossible, because you need to upload a passport. I'm not going to upload a passport to Meta, right? That's even worse than having my kids being around on social media. So, but again, I think it's symbolic, and it will help parents and schools to actually take a little bit more control and not be, well, this is not something that we can do. For example, there's a huge debate in the Netherlands about using phones on schools. We don't have a ban, but there's a clear government guideline saying if you're on elementary school, so up until 12 years old, you should not have a phone with you, which makes sense, right? But it doesn't make sense, because like 50% of the kids, they have it in school. So I think this gives clear guidelines to schools that then can say, well, if you're in elementary school, don't take your phone with you, which kind of makes sense to me as a parent, but also as an academic. But it's not going to solve our problems. We have to deal with it, I guess. And it's also a learning curve, because it's all new, right? As you said before, like the TikTok and stuff like that. It wasn't there 5-10 years ago. It was completely different. And we don't know what will happen in 5 years. The thing I worry about, and I do see that in research, is that the algorithms guide you towards certain content. Our Danish colleagues discovered that if you have a certain profile, your risk of getting exposed to drug advertisements is higher for other profiles, and I think that's very problematic, of course. And then we have to deal with private companies that basically don't care because they're making money. So I think this is actually one of the major bottlenecks, that we now depend on companies that actually host a part of our daily lives, and we don't really have control over that. So I don't know what you Americans and Australians think about having these platforms more, I don't know, more governance, more, I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell me something. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think at the very least, the reason why I like this topical conversation is it gets people to the table thinking and talking about things that are important, right? Because I think prior to having a comprehensive discussion around these topics, it's very much your own siloed thoughts, right? It's like, well, I have kids and my kids are doing this well or not doing well, therefore I think this is right. But when you have policy and laws coming in, it really makes you think about, is this effective? What is it that we're trying to ban? Is it social media completely? LinkedIn is social media, just in case folks don't know this, right? Like, LinkedIn is a social media, so when we're talking about the ban on social media, again, I don't think 16-year-olds are running to LinkedIn to get a profile, but it gets people thinking about not just what platforms, but what do these platforms that we're all reticent toward what do they have in common that we're like, okay, this and this is why we want to impose a certain ban. And I think getting these conversations started, bringing people, whether it's social psychologists or behavioral economics, people to the table to talk about what their research has found. And so if a ban is a Band-Aid, what could be a more permanent solution, right? Is it education? Is it this or that? Like, how do we get the detrimental aspects of social media lessened while still giving people individual freedoms to explore what they want to do, whether it's monetizing off of these platforms or whatever the case may be. But I like this conversation, given that it gets people thinking about it beyond just my own thoughts, my own experiences, but let's hear what you have to say. Like, how does this work for you? Like, what are the root causes and problems? So at the very least, very open to these conversations, because not everyone's going to read certain books. So if we could talk about it and understand these policies, what they're targeting, I think it's a step forward in that regard. Yeah.
Well, I want to shift us over to another topic, since sort of in keeping with this idea of a moving power hour. So we know that some platforms like Meta have stopped content moderation, or at least proactive content moderation, in favor of community notes. So how do we feel about that as a strategy for social media providers to manage their platforms as opposed to more direct engagement? It's now sort of an unfiltered and dispersed set of responsibilities across the user base.
So before we jump in, I want to make sure we're clear on community notes, right? I know it from Reddit, from my own experiences, but we're talking about users of the platform acting as moderators, right? And creating these notes where I can then immediately fact check what's happening. I know we see it a lot on Twitter or X as well. And so looking at those community notes, the goal presumably is to hold each other accountable. And so it's been an interesting observation on my end to see how that plays out on different platforms, but just making sure we're on the same page there.
Mm-hmm. How do we feel about that one?
I mean, me personally, I think we rely on platforms a lot, and we're assuming that they care as much as we do, that they're not, working against their own profit margins, that these are things that would be good for them as well. And I don't think that's always the case, right? I think in this instance, you can cut back on costs by not having to be the moderator, but at the risk of you don't know how it's being moderated. And so that's certainly something that I think we've overall in cyber kind of relied on these platforms to be, right? What comes to mind is the Lori Drew case, right, with MySpace. And the only reason she got in trouble was because it was a violation of their terms of use. And so, kind of thinking about the platform's role in not only defining but enforcing is really intriguing.
So I still have an account, for better or worse, on X, or formerly known as Twitter. And I guess my observations around seeing community notes on that platform, they have been quite useful. And I think particularly we've had a lot of elections globally, not just in Australia, obviously the US and in other countries. And the way that I've probably seen them work really well, really positively, is where there have been posts around videos or around pictures or around headlines trying to, I guess, create a narrative around something that's happened that's relevant, but actually that was from 2014, or it was from a previous election, or it's just completely artificially created, so it's generative AI. And I think that certainly has been useful as I've been going through my feed, to just, as I'm scrolling through, looking and going, oh, you take a moment, you look at it, and then you see the community note that says, actually, this is relevant to a different person, or this didn't happen, or I do find them useful in that way. But am I comfortable with only community notes kind of monitoring what's on there? I think that's probably a bit more problematic, because it's still on there. So despite the fact that there's a note saying that this isn't valid, it's not removing the post, it's still allowing that post to generate views, it's still allowing that post to generate, I guess, a continuation of the narrative that it intended, regardless of whether it's been fact-checked by somebody else.
I'm going to agree with Dr. Cross here and say that I think that the community notes are very useful, but as the only tool, I'm concerned. And my brain always goes in many of the social media platforms to kind of this nebulous black box of I'm going to get all sorts of content. When in reality, it's very reflexive. The content that we see tends to be tailored for us, to the ideas that we already have. And so when I'm going to be engaging with the content, it's going to be things that I already believe. And so my community notes are going to be a little bit less global, and instead they're going to be a little bit more localized than they probably should be.
I worry about the media literacy and competency of a lot of users to actually read a note and understand what it means. Because, at least in my own experience, I blow right past that stuff unless I'm really paying attention. And so, while it can be useful, I wonder how many people even necessarily take the time to read them or process what they mean.
Yeah, I would side on that as well. Like I see harms on both sides. So when we think about content moderators by the platform, I question AI fairness or moderation fairness, right? In that, are you particularly moderating a particular lens of an issue, or are multiple sides being moderated fairly in the term of AI fairness and that sort of fair coverage, right? So while I worry about that, I also worry about, well, if we don't have platform moderators, we have to trust people to be media literate, which I don't know which side is better or worse in that regard, right? So while we tried the former experience, now we're in, especially with X, we're in this community note phase. So we'll see how things work, but I have issues on both ends, and I'm not sure which side I lean toward necessarily.
I wonder if we're going to move towards thinking about X particularly, right? You have the kind of running numbers of this has been retweeted, this has been liked. I wonder if we're going to get to sort of a moderation, right, version of that, where now it's got 75 red flags, right? Maybe I don't need to trust that as much as something that maybe gets 3. Right? And so maybe less about reading and interpreting the note, but digesting it in a way that is a lot easier for us to just kind of read while we're skimming. Not necessarily, again, the best option, but certainly something to make sure that information is getting to the people reading it. But yeah, I share the concerns of also who's making the decisions of what's right and wrong, right? I have to assume that these moderators are factual people, that they are not then just creating their own, right? It kind of comes back to that, is not to get into a rabbit hole here, but disinformation is information, but who's deciding it's disinformation, right? And so that whole conversation comes into play, and I think, at least from what I've seen on Reddit, you have, I don't know, star moderators, right? But people that are trusted to be moderators. And so I wonder if maybe getting into more of an established role as a moderator would help. I don't know.
Yeah, I think both of them have their own issues, because even if you're a star moderator, you might be a moderator in a certain group with a certain idea, so I think all of these things have huge limitations. As a scientist, I would want to know more about how do we digest the information, and why do I see the red flags as something bad while you say, oh no, but if it has red flags, it means somebody else thinks it's bad, so it's good. I mean, we have to understand that part, right? And that's not my cup of tea, but I would definitely think that that's something which is very important. Again, about my own kids, they grow up in a world where they have to deal with misinformation, disinformation. I don't think that we grew up in the same kind of sphere. I think everything I saw on television was kind of true, or on the radio, or in newspapers. Now they kind of doubt everything, which is awkward, but also good, because I think that's essential, that if you doubt it, you need to check it. And then, of course, we need to figure out a way of either having a moderator or somebody else saying, okay, this is kind of good information. I don't know if this helps the discussion, but I think that's actually... I would be really interested to see how this develops in the next 5 years or so.
I laugh because this is a very personal anecdote, but when I was a kid, my grandmother used to get what was called the Weekly World News, which was a tabloid that had the most outlandish, crazy stories you can think of in it, like this thing called Bat Boy, who was a seemingly mutant boy who looked like a bat. And she would read it and call it the paper. And so, like, there was a story in the paper about how Burl Ives sold drugs to school children. He was a singer from, actor and all of that. None of that was true. And it was an interesting way to kind of come to understand not everything that you read is factual, but how do you know what is real and what isn't? Now, granted, that's a very specific case to me, but I think we have some analogs that we can point to in the past, whether it's the Inquirer or other, and again, that's a very US specific kind of context, but there are things that we can point to. Granted, you're buying something like that as a newsstand for entertainment value. Would a platform like X or Meta or otherwise say user content is just purely for entertainment purposes and it's up to you to determine political or other bent? I don't know. Sorry, that was not necessarily the best tangent, but
It makes sense though that it kind of gets at a lot of the larger conversations we've had, that these are the same behaviors, they're just adapting, right? It's the same way of picking and choosing. I choose to go to X over Instagram because it's quicker, it's faster, there's more information to be had in a swipe of my feed, right? But at the same time, Twitter and X is a platform that has its own stance on things and is run by people with very specific beliefs of what information should look like. And so I think, me personally, I think we're going to see platforms that are truly neutral, or at least attempt to be neutral, kind of push forward the agenda while the other ones fall off. Because I think about, some of these platforms that exist, the one that got banned during the last election that I can't remember, right? It was because it was so poorly run and moderated that it fell off of views. And so I wonder if, the platforms themselves, as they get better about moderating things, will see more success because of that.
So we've been talking about this at an individual level. You've got a bunch of social scientists around the table. At an organizational level, this should be interesting as well. I've been talking to some of the computer scientists in these organizations, and often company policies prohibit, say, having a social media presence on platforms that are not moderated. So now we're seeing this kind of stance. At the very least, organizational corporate policies are going to have to change. Otherwise, we'll see kind of a drastic fall off of use from organizations on these social media platforms.
And that actually brings up a great point too, like on a large scale, right? In the US, we have the freedom of speech, right? You're not going to be able to take, certain things down because I posted them, right? But other countries may have different ways of handling that. They may be okay with saying, this, that, and the other. And so does it come down to where the platform is housed? Does it come down to how many countries this is reaching, right? And those decisions are all being made by people with opinions. And so it's so tricky.
So another topic that we can go on to if anybody's willing to shift gears, but it's very, very related, is the issue of pornography bans, or at least IP-based bans, depending on where you are. That's currently a US phenomena, but it might be spreading to other places. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether that is necessary, questionable, of value. Should we be protecting children more proactively than we are? I'm curious to hear some thoughts.
So it is targeted at children,
Yes.
correct? Okay. And is the age 16, 18? Has that been well established?
That's a good question. Do you know?
I thought it was 21 from what I read.
21. Interesting. Okay.
But
so you
I'm
can
not,
go to war,
but
but you
I'm
can't
not
watch
sure.
porn.
But I'm not entirely sure. But
Okay.
I thought it was the legal age.
Interesting. Okay.
These are all state laws at the moment, and
Okay.
all of them are targeting children.
Yeah.
The age itself can change. However, there are
The
some
objective is-
proposals now looking at broadly pornography bans.
Can somebody explain to the European guy how does it work? Because I got a computer at home. My kids use the same computer. Do they need to verify that they're my kids or something like that? How would it work in practice?
Coming from a state that has this, the approach has been if your IP address is showing a specific location, in my case Virginia, then your kind of big pornography organizations are now requiring that you upload a photo ID as
Really?
you use the the website. Now, it's been some pushback. Some of your bigger companies have just said, we're not operating in that state anymore, and they actually have kind of a policy page as a splash page saying, contact your legislation, we're not doing this. So there are lots of large kind of issues. In fact, the running joke is VPN use skyrockets in these states as soon as they enact the bill.
Which is good.
Yeah,
Right?
it's so interesting because it comes back to that basic privacy question.
Yeah.
What am I allowed to do with the devices and the network that I'm on? You can't tell me I can't go do X, Y, Z because I'm an adult and I have a device and I can get on the internet. And so if it's falling to platforms and they're not enforcing it, right? They're actively saying we're not going to do this. Then again, to your question earlier, right? What are we trying to enforce? What are these outcomes that we're looking for? Because now are parents with kids just never allowed to access porn on their computers because a kid could be on that device? Well, that seems like that's going to be an issue. And so it's a weird enforcement, and uploading pictures is scary. Not only one, like let's say it is a child, right? And they say, nope, you're not allowed. Okay, well now a porn company has a picture of my child? That's wild to me.
Yeah, like this is one instance where I question the method to reach the objective. If the objective is to better youth and to help youth audiences, I feel like banning a few major sites will not stop or prevent that child from accessing that content. So this is what, and we're going back a few topics now, but this to me sounds like a Band-Aid, and we don't have a quote-unquote cure in mind or a reasonable solution. It's just, hey, we don't have the people to think this through. Here's a Band-Aid. I hope it stops bleeding. But then if you think it through, it's like, let's say there was a 15-year-old that wanted to access content. Let's say they go to Google, the first three, links, doesn't work. It shows you what Dr. Dearden just said. This whole little page about, hey, yeah, you can't access this. Google has several pages of content you can go through. And I don't think these individuals are like, no, I have to go to site 1, site 2, and site 3, and if that doesn't work out, forget it, I'm done, right? Like from the rational choice perspective, like the cost and the consequences do not outweigh this purported gain. And so it's like, I don't know how effective this is from the legislation standpoint. Is this actually working? But two, if it's not working, why are we enforcing this? How many people is it stopping versus letting through, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a perfect question. So is it meant to stop young children from accessing all kind of porn, or porn that is mentally bad for you, like the extreme variants? Is there anything known about
You'd
it?
think it's the enforcement's almost the opposite, right? They're going after the major companies that presumably have these kind of regulations in place, right? Like Pornhub said they're going to take down anything revenge porn related, right? That's not really the term we use anymore, but non-consensual shared images. And so if Pornhub is the one that's getting banned, well, they're the ones that are actually doing some regulation and doing some good and making sure that, I don't want to say the right porn, but the stuff that you would be okay with, like normal human development, right? But the violence, the aggressive porn, the stuff that is really what you want to keep your kids from, that's going to be on that 7th page of Google, right? It's not going to be the one getting banned.
The 4th link.
Yeah.
Like it's not like, just again, like I haven't ran this experiment, but I don't think if you got a randomized sample of youth in a room and a computer and you told them, hey, there are bans, now go access what you want, I don't think you'll have people who are like, listen, I gave up, like I tried all that I could and like y'all win. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think they're going to be like, okay, cool, found it, 35 seconds.
Honestly, they can just go on Snapchat or Instagram
Or Twitter.
any other image-based platform.
Yeah.
It's interesting the lengths that people go, I suppose. Some of our data, I'm working with some colleagues on hacking, and we've seen computers hacked where people literally hack into the computer to watch porn. And when you look at their IP addresses, they're coming from countries that have entire porn bans. Mm-hmm. And really, to all these topics, one of the things I found fascinating is we're really targeting the end user and not talking at all about things like corporate responsibility.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I feel like that's almost completely abandoned, the idea of corporations having any responsibility to manage the online space. I don't know if that's because of, what is that, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act coming in, or something else. But at least in the US, the current prevailing logic is that platforms are not responsible for user-generated content in any way, shape, or form. And as long as that remains in place, I would imagine, why would we do anything?
I think we talked about experimental studies before, right? And what I learned when I was in Australia is that actually on Pornhub, they do collaborate with researchers to very specific content. If you're looking for it, you get a pop-up message or whatever. And I think that's brilliant, because you got the right people at the moment looking for something that we think they shouldn't look at. And I think that's the responsibility of Pornhub in that case. That might not apply to all of the shit that they have on there, but at least to very specific content. So I think we should try to get more of these companies to do that, actually, and not try to ban everybody, because we also know that doesn't work. Well, apparently more people use VPN, so that's good.
Well, I was going to say
People
Tor.
develop hacking skills, so that's good, but that's not the effect that you want to reach with this, right?
I'd say it does kind of force people to think about their own privacy, right? It's okay if they have the ability to know that I'm a child, right? Then they have the ability to know a lot of things about me. And what am I willing to give up to these platforms? You know, I don't know, hopefully people are thinking about it. But what comes to my mind is Tor, right? The dark web. This has been a tool that's used in countries that have bans on things, overseas. And so what's stopping kids from downloading Tor? Literally nothing. And Tor certainly is not going to be the company to put their foot down and say, we're going to play this game. So I think, again, we're getting at technical responses to social issues and how much of this is just educating kids to be smart online users. Again, end users are the key, then let's educate those end users.
So let's switch to a different topic. How do we feel about naming and shaming policies for nation states? So as an example, if the United States is hacked by the Chinese military, then research is done, the FBI names the following individuals associated with the People's Liberation Army and says, we're going to sanction these individuals because we know we can never arrest them, we're not going to be able to extradite them, so this is the next best solution. Do we feel like this is a strategy that's going to have any deterrent value or any impact, or is this just the best possible thing that we can do?
Can we define what you mean by sanction? And the reason I say that is because in my mind, it sounds like I'm going to write your name on a piece of paper and say you can't come here again, right? Like, what does sanction actually mean in this context?
In a lot of cases, it's more economic in nature.
Gotcha. So fines.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, I guess a good example in the Australian context is Medibank. We had a big data breach at the end of 2022. Where there was 9.7 million Australians who had their personal information exposed. The Australian government has put out sanctions in 24 and then again further sanctions earlier this year in 25 around a number of individuals as well as a Russian entity. And just to your point around what sanctions are. So from an Australian perspective, they announced sanctions to make it a criminal offence to provide assets to this company and also to provide any assets to the individuals to use to deal with them, to interact with them, as well as the sanction also prohibiting them from travelling to Australia. So in terms of, I guess, the effectiveness of this, it probably, it has a symbolic impact in terms of naming who is alleged to have perpetrated that particular hack. I'm always thinking about things from a victim perspective. For the 9.7 million people who were impacted for this particular data breach, and for those who actually experienced a range of impacts from having their data exposed, this means nothing, I would say. That it hasn't changed, it hasn't reduced the impact of the data breach on their experience, it hasn't done anything to mitigate the harms that they may have incurred, it hasn't helped them financially overcome anything. Their information is still out there. It hasn't really done anything. But I guess from perhaps a collective, a state perspective, there's some symbolic value in being able to name the person to put these sanctions on there. But yeah, I think from the victim perspective, I would say that there's really nothing that is going to come from the Australian government and also the UK and US, who also supported this naming of this particular incident. I don't think there's any impact for that.
That's interesting. Is there any research about it where victims, you asked these very specific questions to the victims, right? That I would be really interested to figure out if that's true, because the people I talk to, they know that the bad guys won't get caught, and they just want to be recognized as a victim. They want some help, support, and stuff like that. But I'm just thinking out loud here. Maybe it could help them a little bit, but again, I would need empirical evidence to support
true.
it.
I mean, we do have some survey data that we're currently analysing around the Medibank data breach in particular. And we did ask a question around who they thought was responsible for the data breach. And it was an open-ended response. And it is interesting to scroll through the 2,000 responses that there were actually a number of people who foresaw the fact that it was Russian hackers. So they name Russia as being responsible for it. There were other countries that people thought might be responsible. So, I mean, I think from a victim perspective, there are generally some ideas and understandings about who is perpetrating these large-scale data breaches or other types of cybercrimes that are relevant in terms of sanctions. But it would be interesting to kind of, I guess, dig a bit deeper and ask if these sanctions really do have any impact on perhaps their sense of justice, that even though nobody is in prison for it, that somebody has been identified and named. I don't know. We don't have those answers yet.
No, let's find it out.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I think it's interesting because it's kind of the opposite of the conversation we were having before, which now we're relying on these third-party companies to be the response, right? I'm not going to bother calling the local police to tell them that my credit card was being used, but I am going to call my credit card company and say, hey, you need to take this off of my charge. You know, that wasn't me. And so it's almost flipped, all right? And I think it has to do with the victim as myself and the victim as my information, right? And so if my information is what's being harmed or used inappropriately, these third parties are the ones that are going to be able to do something about it. Whether they do or not, I can't speak to. Luckily, I haven't had anything stolen from me recently, but I think it comes down to this question, which we have with a lot of cybercrime, is are people even reporting it? And if these are the responses where they feel like nothing's happening, or, I get a pamphlet saying, be careful, call your bank, then maybe I'm not going to report it next time because it's not worth it to me. And so that really impacts not only our understanding of cybercrime, but how these victim experiences matter.
I mean, we certainly know from the research that does exist that a lot of cybercrime isn't reported for that exact reason, that people just don't think there is any value
To the police, or in general.
that there's no value to themselves for having
No, but not reported to the
anything.
police, or
No, I mean, I think generally speaking, I think it's probably it would be more so for the police, that there's no value reporting to the police because nothing can be done.
Yeah.
So if you look at some of the research that does, I guess in some of my context around data breaches, most people will report to banks because there is that financial imperative over unauthorized transactions or credit card details being exposed. So banks in some ways, I think, do see a larger portion of some of these incidents compared to police. But if you are the victim and you know that there is nothing that is valuable or nothing that can happen, then all of the negativity, we know, the overwhelming negativity of reporting these types of incidents to police, not just in Australia, but many other countries, it doesn't necessarily provide a motivator for victims to do that unless they feel that there's this altruistic notion of, I want to report it knowing that nothing will happen in my circumstance, but I want to report it to prevent it from happening to others. So there is that, I guess, that tension around reporting in the first instance and the expectations of what happens from reporting, and also who you report it to.
Well, and to the emotionality of it, right? We know so many people don't report because they're just embarrassed they fell victim in the first place. And so, even if, the response of 9.7 Americans, Australians, wrong country, they not every single one of them may feel that the response was appropriate, but at least they feel a sense of community and that it wasn't just me. It wasn't me that messed up. It wasn't me that trusted the wrong person, right? Think about here, Experian being the tax company, I guess. I don't know what their title would be technically, right? But they had a huge breach, and there are so many Americans that had their information out there that you didn't have to think about it as I messed up, I did something wrong, but that this third party is what did wrong. And so I think that's where, some of these responses coming from the third party is to be expected. And especially with banks, I mean, they have the financial reasons to do so, right? They're trying to protect their assets as well. So
So the Equifax.
Equifax,
Credit union
my
breach.
bad. I don't know.
Yeah.
It started with an E.
The nation state attacks, nation sponsored attacks, this is always kind of the black box for me. It's always the one that fascinates me when I go to conferences. You have kind of what's publicly available, right? These kind of overhead sanctions. And you have so much that I've learned that happens that is unknown, at least to the majority of people. And these are countries cooperating with each other. Often these are kind of financial clawbacks that occur that can really dismantle these organizations. So as much as we say that this is a name and shame, this is kind of just a overview of some of the things that happens. There are certainly things that are happening that we don't see, often including some type of monetary clawback or sanctions, working with countries that often don't work together.
And this is kind of what I was thinking about was we talked about from the victim's perspective, but I'd be curious to know from the offender's standpoint if this has any sort of deterrence effect on them, like on that behavior, right? Like if the consequence of your behavior is a name and shame tactic, will that deter you from engaging that behavior? And I think we have to know what they're motivated by to begin with, right? And I think there's always the assumption that it's going to be monetary. But we know from years and years of research that sometimes there are many times where it's not monetary. So you putting on a monetary fine doesn't really do much if my political motivations far outweigh anything else, or if the motivations of me being more accepted within this exclusive group weighs more than the monetary sanction, right? So the whole name and shame seems like a last minute resort of like, hey, we can't do this, we can't do that, so let's do this at least for the symbolic perspective of it all. But yeah, like I'd be curious to know why convicted offenders, or not convicted, but why known offenders engage in certain crimes, and if certain deterrence mechanisms that we think are working, if they're actually working to deter that behavior. Because if they're not, this goes back to my earlier point about maybe I'm not understanding the objective of certain strategies or policies, right? Because if it's just for symbolic purposes, great, but is that why it's being used? And if it's not, are we reaching our goals with this tactic, right? Because if we're doing this and if it keeps happening, I question why, like, the effectiveness of that approach.
Yeah.
Right.
I think we're not going to deter these criminals. I think it might even help their reputation. So if you want to build a good reputation and you're going to be named by the Australian government, that's really cool, of course. But I think we should look at this from a victim perspective, and I think we should look at whether or not this helps them in whatever they need to be more resilient or to be empowered. And it might also help some underlying politics between countries and whatever, but I think we should really look at this from a victim perspective. From offender perspective, it's not going to do anything to protect attacks, that's for sure. Because these attacks are either from state-funded things or highly professional organizations, and they are not going to be scared by this at all.
So let's keep on this vein, but on a different topic. Should we consider a nation state sponsored, whether that's direct or indirect, some kind of nation state sponsored cyber activities to be crime, or should we be treating everything as an act of warfare? So going with the Metabank breach as an example, should this be thought of as an aggressive act of war, even though yes, it was economic in nature? The outcomes of Metabank where victims' personal information at a very profound level was posted online and done so to embarrass or shame or otherwise humiliate some of the victims. So should we just treat this as cybercrime as normal or something different?
I don't know. I mean, I think, let's just cut this part out. I don't have an answer.
I'm saying I think where my brain goes is how we define terrorism and acts of terrorism is that it's not necessarily the act itself, right? I can put a bomb in the middle of this room and explode it for my own reasons, but if I'm doing it on behalf of my country, it has different meaning, it has different motivations. And so I think when we get to things like this, if their goal was to just say, hey, I'm a super cool hacker from Russia and I'm really good at my job, then maybe we could tie it to cyber warfare and say, listen, this is a nation trying to show that they have assets over us or skills over us. But if it was simply to get at the economic breach, then I don't think you can consider it warfare, right? And so I think it really gets into what's their motivation and why are they doing it in the first place? And we're not always going to have those answers.
True. And I do think this is a very important question because I talk a lot about cybercrime and then everybody says, okay, do you also know about cyber warfare? Well, if you would compare that to traditional crimes, if you were to be a police officer, nobody would ask you about warfare because you're a police officer, right? When it comes to cyber, everything is in one big pile of shit. Sorry, maybe edit it out.
No, that's true.
But it's not, right? And the only issue here is, and you mentioned it before, is we don't always know. So I would treat all of these things like more into the espionage kind of thing. And then when something is espionage, you also don't say, okay, we're now going to war. We're trying to fight it. We're trying to do something against it. And if you know it's crime, it's crime. If you know it's warfare, but there's a really large gray area in between.
Yeah, there's a real large gray area. I mean, for example, if you have, say, a nation state who is ignoring the actions of a specific group that they know is, say, targeting another nation, they're not supporting them, they're just ignoring their illegal activity. You know, is this falling under the warfare? Interestingly enough, the Microsoft Digital Defense Report recently in 2024 talked about this question, and they seem to take the stance that this is so normalized that we don't consider it warfare, though if we think about it, it probably is. It's just something that we're all doing, so how can we call it warfare at that point?
So I'm thinking now of organized crime, and we got a lot of drugs coming in the Netherlands via the big harbors. It's coming in from South America, we know. Are we at war with South America? I don't think so, right? Even though we know that some of the governments are lenient towards the groups that actually produce the drugs there. So I think, again, I agree with you that there are some nations that might even support criminals to hack into US, Australian, European countries. But I also don't think that that is necessarily always an act of war. But again, we just don't know, right? It's a very gray area. Yeah.
And I think it's easy as an American to forget that we're doing these things, right? We are hiring and teaching and educating hackers for our behalf, right? I think a lot of Americans like to separate themselves from it and say, well, that's what China's doing, that's what Russia's doing. It's like, well, we are hiring hackers just the same. We are doing very similar things, but we couch it in intelligence gathering. And so when does it become warfare? Does it have to be actionable? Does it have to be, does action actually have to be taken upon it, or is just taking the information good enough?
I think the one thing that concerns me in treating it just as crime is that there's so much collateral damage, thinking again about Medibank. The civilian populations that are harmed in some cases irreparably as a consequence of a nation-state sponsored attack can be serious. But if we treat it as crime, well, then nothing's going to happen. So granted, a Department of Defense response may be too much, but certainly DoD has published in the past their sort of guidelines around proactive offensive efforts in response to, whereas retaliation for. And so there's times when I think maybe it would be better to treat this more severely than we do. So that way, as you said, it's not just a normalized, it's the cost of living or doing business, because that's outrageous. We wouldn't accept that otherwise. So why do we do it here?
And this is a thought that I had too as we were talking about it. I was thinking about in my head what would constitute warfare as an act, and I would the first two things were, does it impact the masses? Does it generate fear? And I'm not saying these are threshold items that we have to include, but my mind went to, does it generate fear and does it impact the masses, right? And the example that we just talked about seems to impact the entire country or a large segment of the country, and it generates fear for your personal information to go online. And so if that's the case, my second question then is, what are the consequences of calling something just a cybercrime versus a warfare attack, right? Like what ramifications does that bring, right? This is why you don't just go around and you call people, oh, you're an extremist or you're that. Like, what are the consequences of calling it one thing and then adjudicating it as that, right? Because, going a topic back, if we're looking at from the victim's perspective, right? Calling it a cyber attack and then going, well, turns out we can't do much, right? I don't think that's good for the nation state that was attacked, nor for the individual victims of that nation state, right? So what are the consequences or the next step actions if we were to call something like a mass data breach affecting an entire nation state? What would the consequences be if we were to call it and adjudicate the act as a warfare attack, right? Because I think then that gets us thinking about, okay, if we want to call something as a cybercrime attack versus a warfare attack, the latter has to have A, B, and C. Otherwise, we'll do this. Like, because I think shy of having some sort of, not a threshold, but some sort of list, we do this whole thing about, well, relative to what I think, relative to that. And I wonder if that's helpful, right? So
I think by not calling it cyber warfare and not getting to some of these actions, we've seen some degree of escalation. Go from information gathering to, say, financial theft to infrastructure attacks, all the way back to Stuxnet. You've got these kind of very specific attacks that do system damage, have detrimental effects on infrastructure, whether that's energy grid or water or, say, nuclear power facilities, that if we did the same thing with a weapon, it would absolutely be warfare. And so I think by not calling certain things warfare, we're losing ground.
I think the question is, what does it mean if you would call it warfare? I mean, in your example, if Russia would drop a bomb in Amsterdam, there would be war and you would retaliate, right? But the Russians, it was in the newspaper last week, there was a big hack at the Dutch police, and everybody always thought it was the Russians, and now it turned out that they actually, it actually led to a Russian group. So they have all of the information about all of the police officers in the Netherlands. It was a huge hack in November last year. I remember because I was at the conference with police people, and they were really, really scared. Are we at war with Russia? I think we already are, right? But what does it mean? Like, what is the consequence of this? We're going to hack back. I'm sure we're already doing it. So it's also a matter of, okay, it's not, warfare is not as clear as it used to be, right? So I don't have the answer to this, but it's just also, this is the reality that we are in now. We don't know if it's cybercrime. We don't know if it's cyber warfare. If it is, how should we respond? Is it always visible? Maybe all sorts of things are already going on, and we just don't know. I always don't trust people that are able to tell me exactly what's going on when it comes to cyber warfare, because I don't think we can, right? So everybody that says, no, it's like this, I don't trust them, because there is no empirical evidence to actually support that. We don't actually know where it's going, but I think it's interesting times.
I think anecdotally too, the deterrence aspect of who's responding matters a lot, because I could name you at least 4 or 5 people that have had, FBI knock on their door saying, hey, you need to stop pirating those things. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, I won't do it again. But if the DOD's knocking on my door, it's a very different conversation, right? It's a big difference. So I'm not saying I did those things, you guys. But it certainly is a different response if I have a military, important person standing there in front of me versus the FBI saying, hey, don't do that again.
All right, so last shot. Hopefully this one will be interesting. And it might fly in the face of the discussion we've had so far, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Should we just stop calling it cybercrime and just treat it as crime? Drop the cyber, it's all just crime.
No.
Why not?
Because we need fund, we need the money. So yes, it's just crime. And I think we all started doing research in cybercrime years ago. When I started 15, 16 years ago, I thought, well, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, we don't need to call it cybercrime anymore. But we still need to do it, because otherwise, what happens with cybercrimes when the police is trying to do something, they're not, because it's scary. It's with computers. So what will happen if we don't call it cybercrimes is that all normal police teams have to deal with it, and they're not going to do it because we know that there are numerous studies out there showing that they will discard these kind of cases and they will do the street crimes, things that they know. So I think from that perspective alone, we need to still call it cybercrime because that means specific teams, it means funding, and then we need to make sure that the entire organization of the police also has the skills to do it. But that's something we're not ready for yet. So I would say cybercrime is just crime, but we need a specific name for it.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I've thought about this question or that particular statement about is cybercrime crime or is it unique? And I thought about that for a long time. And it's interesting because you were in my head just now. Everything that you said, I've thought about over and over again because in certain circles, saying that it's cybercrime is to the advantage of the project or the task at hand. And in other circles, like when I want to publish in a flagship journal, maybe don't make it sound like it's so narrow and siloed, right? Because then they're going to be like, oh, this is not mainstream. We want something better, right? So I see it both sides. My thing is, we've been doing these naming conventions for other things. There's violent crime and there's property crime. And yet when we think about cybercrime, there's a disconnect. It's almost like, why can't we call it what it is without discounting its legitimacy in the conversation, right? And this might be a whole like pie in the sky thing, but it doesn't seem like we're doing this for many other things, right? Like we know that law enforcement prioritize violent crimes. We know that civilians, when we give them ranking systems of 5 different crime types, which one is more consequential? Most often they'll say that violent crimes are more serious, right? So it's to me, it's not even the naming convention. It's why can't or we need to get toward a model where we call it cybercrime because we're acknowledging its properties that are different from offline crime without discounting that crime is crime and crime is crime. You wouldn't say that a property crime isn't crime. We've moved past that sort of understanding. And so I think what I try to do in my own classes when I teach and in my own research is get people to understand that crime is crime and crime is crime, but to acknowledge the uniqueness of each crime type so that if you are in that particular booth doing that sort of crime investigation, you can appreciate both sides. You are fighting crime, but the crime that you're fighting is unique in and of itself. So maybe you have to adopt different tactics, right? Because all of us in this room, we've seen papers, we've written papers about do mainstream conventional crime theories empirically predict cybercrimes. They do a fairly good job, I would argue. So we're at that understanding where, yes, it is unique, but it's also crime. How do we disseminate this knowledge to the masses where it's not unique enough where people are like, oh, I can't do this. I'm law enforcement. I don't do cyber, right? So
I think that there's been something of a natural evolution with the combination of training and skills needed as well as jurisdiction. I remember being with an officer quite a few years ago at this point, and he got a phone call, and the phone call was somebody who'd been victimized on Craigslist. And the officer said, well, I can't really do anything for you other than file a report, call the FBI. And as you can imagine, this local country guy who's calling this county police or county sheriff's office saying, I'm not going to call the FBI for a $50 Craigslist scam. These are really the people who would have had the jurisdiction and the skills to investigate. So we do have some kind of this natural evolution that's come about because of the fairly unique, maybe global nature of cybercrime that has at least impacted our organizations at a fairly local level.
And I think there are some challenges that we have created in trying to keep cyber. Because if you go to one of your points around the visibility, so if you give people kind of 5 offences, they're more likely to rate, I guess, traditional or offline street crime as more serious. But that's about visibility. And if you think about police officers, many of them are more comfortable in investigating and following through with, I guess, your more traditional street crime. But that's just level of confidence, that's level of training, that's level of experience. If we start to break it down and just expect that all kind of general duties or first responders will have a certain level of knowledge around all crime types, whether they're online or offline.
Yeah.
If we stop kind of boxing it into this is a specialist crime that only a particular unit can deal with. For a lot of this, for a lot of offences, regardless of whether they occur online or offline, it's really an arbitrary distinction. And many of the street crimes that officers are investigating, they have an online component, they have a digital component. There's been text messages, there's been emails, there's been social media chats. So I think it's this arbitrary line that we still have created that in some ways I think actually works to our detriment around trying to upskill people and around trying to break down this division. So in fraud, which is I guess my lane, I have argued that I think online fraud is actually just fraud. It's all about deception. It's all about that financial reward for the offender. The victim, I don't think cares whether we call it online fraud or fraud. They are looking for a response. They are looking for an outcome. They are unlikely to get it, whether it's cyber or not. So I think sometimes language is really important, but the way that we use it and the times that we choose to use it, I don't necessarily think work for us all the time.
I think that's completely true, but the thing is that online crimes, take online fraud as an example. Usually the offender and victim are kind of in the same area, right? With cyber, with online, you don't have these kind of things. So the offender can be in a completely different region. So it has its specific problems. And I do think that, like, if you compare online fraud 15 years ago with now, 15 years ago it was highly specialized, you needed to have a specialized team. Now, not anymore, I hope. So I do think there's a development there. But I do also think that we need to keep having that kind of development, because we need to have highly skilled teams that do the new innovative crimes that are normal in 5 or 10 years. And I think having like a sort of cyber-dependent, cyber-enabled crime kind of distinction helps to at least say, okay, we need to have a certain amount of people that are able to do the new types of crimes. And then they need to make sure that the rest of the organization learns, and that we learn how to deal with them. And I think because some of the problems are new, like the example I gave about the offender might be in a different region than the victim. So you need to have a system to make sure that all of the reporting is centralized and there is some sort of analysis being done there. And then you're good to go. But I do think we need to acknowledge that, it's different sometimes, and yes, all the officers should be able to tackle online frauds. Completely agree.
One of the things that has really surprised me, we've just collected some data here in Michigan asking residents about their experiences with cybercrime. So just using one incident as an example, we had 1,300 people respond, and 5% of that sample experienced non-consensual image sharing. Only 18% of those people contacted their local agency. But 85% of those who contacted their local agency reported being either satisfied or very satisfied with the experience. So I wonder if we're coming from sort of a built-in position of bias where we don't have good data in the US, just as an example, to really know how effective police are. We have this perception that local agencies aren't going to be able to do this and that they need specialized responses. But I wonder if that truly is the case. And if it's not, how do we retrain ourselves, and how do we help the police as well know you're actually really good at this and you may already know it, maybe you don't, but overwhelmingly, now granted, reporting was low in the data that we had, but more than half of every single population was satisfied with the police response, even for something like sextortion, which we would not have expected.
No?
But is that just a result from, I guess, the upskilling of officers around sexual violence, around responding, having a trauma-informed response to particularly sexual offences?
That's an excellent question. I have no idea, but that's something that definitely merits consideration.
Yeah.
What keeps coming to my mind is, we're all academics, we're social scientists. That's how we think about things. And I think the reason that this distinction even exists in the first place is because from an academic perspective, from a how are we understanding these things, it takes additional skills to understand cybercrime. Not always, but in some cases it does. And the parallel in my brain is, if I want to understand the difference between a murder and a mass shooting, it might be that a high caliber weapon is easier to get at more people. Yes, I don't understand how an AK-47 differs from a pistol. I mean, on basics, sure, but I don't need to understand it to understand that behaviorally it means different things. And so from the cybercrime perspective, I tend to take a very technical approach, and I like learning about hackers and how they go about, their network forensics and how they take care of themselves. But that's not the case for all social scientists. And so I think it's less a question about should it be different, but how are we even learning about it in the first place? Are we willing to take the steps to understand those technical components, or are we willing to say, I'm just a social scientist, I'm just going to deal with the behavior that doesn't entail this technology component? And I don't think that's the right answer, but I do at least understand where that differentiation comes in, because I'm sure all of us in this room have had conversations with people who say, "Oh, that's cybercrime. That's not my purview. I don't know how to do that." It's like, well, you're still a behavioral scientist. You still understand how people interact with phones. I think when we talked with Michigan State Police, they said 90% of their cases have some form of digital evidence, mostly mobile phones. And so for us to say, "Oh, sorry, that cybercrime can't handle it," it's just a lack of understanding on our part, in my opinion.
Perhaps we've done a bad job communicating this to the general public as well. Whenever I am somewhere new and someone says, "What do you do?" and I say I'm a professor of criminology, they say, "Oh, I love CSI," and I say I study cybercrime, and that shuts the conversation down real fast.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
I always get questions about very technical aspects, and say, yeah, it's also about digitization of all sorts of crimes, right? And to come back at your point, I do think that one of the biggest unknowns for me is, are we dealing with a new type of offender when we talk about highly skilled hackers, right? Is that a different group compared to the traditional criminals that we know? Self-control, we know there's a big discussion, intelligence, and stuff like that. Because if it is a different group, then they do deserve a different approach. And I'm quite sure that 90% of the cyber criminals are just our traditional criminals that do something with technology, so they don't need special programs or whatever. But I do think there's a very small group that is completely different, and I think we should try to understand them better to make sure that we can have those specialized interventions to get them to work for the police later on or whatever. And I think that makes it also very important to make a distinction between really cyber-dependent criminals and the fraudsters that just happen to use technology because they can make money, right?
I mean, I think that's an important distinction. So we've talked about cyber-enabled and cyber-dependent. So for those listening who might not know, cyber-dependent are offences that really can only happen in an online environment, such as malware and what else is cyber-dependent? Hacking, for example, whereas cyber-enabled crimes are those that do have both, I guess, an online and offline equivalent. So fraud is a great example where technology didn't invent fraud, the internet didn't create fraud. Fraud was happening, has been happening for centuries. So I think there is an important distinction about the role of technology in the offence, and also I guess there's the role of technology and how we respond to it, in terms of how police respond to it, in terms of how our systems are set up for this. If we think about policing in an Australian context, and I think in many other jurisdictions, policing is very much based on kind of geographical boundaries. So the legislation for the Queensland Police, which is the state that I'm in, they only have jurisdiction for some very distinct geographical boundaries around physical space, around physical land. And cyber really challenges that. It challenges the jurisdictions, it challenges the way that we have had hundreds of years of policing kind of to get to this point. And I think we acknowledge the challenges, and there's so many publications that those of us here collectively have written, as well as many other colleagues, that we identify these challenges, but we still kind of haven't pushed beyond saying this is a problem, this is a limitation. We just don't at this point have that kind of next step around how do we solve this problem, because cyber isn't going anywhere, technology isn't going anywhere. We know that things are escalating. We know that the impacts of all of these crimes are really significant, despite there being kind of a lack of visibility. They are really significant on victims, and we have this global, I guess, pool of victims that at this point in time don't really get the same outcomes perhaps don't get the same experiences compared to other types of crime victims. And it's reassuring for your research, Tom, that that small percentage that are going to police are perhaps getting a positive response. But we need to understand that better to be able to widen that to perhaps other types of cybercrime and certainly other jurisdictions, because I think, my own research documents the overwhelming negativity that victims do experience in going to police and other agencies around many of these incidents.
Yeah, so when that example came up, I was like, this tells me that Tom was my mentor, so we recently collected data, a large sample, and I think one of the objectives of this data collection process was to understand why individuals choose to report their victimization, period, right? If you report it, who do you report it to? Why did you report it there, right? And I think one of the aspects that we were trying to tap into is one of our co-PIs is a policing scholar, and so one of the aspects that they cared about the most was procedural justice. Is it that victims of cybercrime are not going to police because they're not treated as if their victimization is legitimate, right? Are they going to their credit card company because maybe the card company is like, oh no, actually, like, we value you calling and we have a solution. Like, what is the reason for doing that, right? And so going off of that whole discussion, I think, like what you said, Dr. Cross, I think it's important to understand the victim's perspective across different types of cybercrime, right? Because maybe they had a positive view because it was a sex crime or a sex-related crime, and historically that's gone well with the police because they're trained to respond to these behaviors, right? But what about fraud, right? Why do victims of fraud refrain from going to the police if that's the case, right? Is it because when they go there, the procedural justice component is lacking, right? So I definitely think more research in that area is needed. So
I think it brings me back to kind of one of my big research questions, eternal research questions, is what does justice look like for cybercrime victims?
absolutely.
Is it just in the context of fraud? Is it just getting the money back? Like, if I'm a victim, if I get my money back, if the bank refunds me, is that enough? Like, am I satisfied? If I don't get my money back for whatever reason, is there any alternative where I can seek closure, or I can feel that justice has been kind of served? Is it, as we mentioned before, having the Australian government name a particular offender from an overseas jurisdiction? Is it being acknowledged by the police that they've taken a report that I am a legitimate victim? Is it being able to access some victim assistance funds? I guess there's so many questions we just don't have answers to around how can we, for such a large global pool of victims, how can we create a sense of, I guess, acknowledgement, a sense of legitimization around their victim status, and create closure or this sense of justice for the incident that has been perpetrated against them.
I feel like that was very well said. I feel like you just kind of hit the nail on the head. There's so much more that can and should and must be done to better understand all of this. This was a fantastic conversation. I know this was very different than how we normally do things, but I am so glad you all were able to join us. I really appreciate you giving your opinions and your insights. This was a really fun discussion. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. I realize it's a little deviation from our norm, but I'm so glad you could join us today, and we'll see you the next time we cross the firewall.
Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.